Chapter 3 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 3 John Thorndyke. That the character of an individual tends to be reflected in his dress is a fact familiar to the least observant. That the observation is equally applicable to aggregates of men is less familiar, but equally true. Do not the members of fighting professions, even to this day, deck themselves in feathers, in gaudy colors and gilded ornaments, after the manner of the African war chief or the redskin brave, and thereby indicate the place of war in modern civilization? Does not the Church of Rome send her priests to the altar in habiliments that were fashionable before the fall of the Roman Empire, in token of her immovable conservatism? And lastly, does not the law, lumbering on in the wake of progress, symbolize its subjection to precedent by headgear reminiscent of the good days of Queen Anne? I should apologize for intruding upon the reader these somewhat trite reflections, which were set going by the quaint stock in trade of the wigmaker's shop in the cloisters of the Inner Temple, whither I strayed on a sultry afternoon in quest of shade and quiet. I had halted opposite the little shop window, and with my eyes bent dreamily on the row of wigs, was pursuing the above train of thought when I was startled by a deep voice saying softly in my ear, "I'd have the full-bottomed one, if I were you." I turned swiftly and rather fiercely, and looked into the face of my old friend and fellow student, Jervis, behind whom, regarding us with a sedate smile, stood my former teacher, Dr. John Thorndyke. Both men greeted me with a warmth that I felt to be very flattering, for Thorndyke was quite a great personage, and even Jervis was several years my academic senior. "You're coming in to have a cup of tea with us, I hope," said Thorndyke, and as I assented gladly, he took my arm and led me across the court in the direction of the Treasury. "But why that hungry gaze at those forensic vanities, Berkeley?" he asked. "Are you thinking of following my example and Jervis's, deserting the bedside for the bar?" "What, has Jervis gone in for the law?" I exclaimed. "Bless you, yes," replied Jervis. "I have become parasitical on Thorndyke. The big fleas have little fleas, you know. I am the additional fraction trailing after the whole number in the rear of a decimal point." "Don't you believe him, Berkeley," interposed Thorndyke. "He is the brains of the firm. I supply the respectability and moral worth. But you haven't answered my question. What are you doing here on a summer afternoon, staring into a wig-maker's window?" "I am Barnard's locum. He is in practice in Fetter Lane." "I know," said Thorndyke. "We meet him occasionally. And very pale and peaky he has been looking of late. Is he taking a holiday?" "Yes, he has gone on a trip to the Isles of Greece in a currant ship." "Then," said Jervis, "you are actually a local G.P. I thought you were looking beastly respectable." "And judging from your leisured manner when we encountered you," added Thorndyke, "the practice is not a strenuous one. I suppose it is entirely local?" "Yes," I replied. "The patients mostly live in the small streets and courts within a half-mile radius of the surgery, and the abodes of some of them are pretty squalid. Oh, and that reminds me of a very strange coincidence. It will interest you, I think." "Life is made up of strange coincidences," said Thorndyke. "Nobody but a reviewer of novels is ever really surprised at a coincidence. But what is yours?" "It is connected with a case that you mentioned to us at the hospital about 2 years ago, the case of a man who disappeared under rather mysterious circumstances. Do you remember it? The man's name was Bellingham." "The Egyptologist? Yes, I remember the case quite well. What about it?" "The brother is a patient of mine. He is living in Neville's Court with his daughter, and they seem to be as poor as church mice." "Really?" said Thorndyke. "This is quite interesting. They must have come down in the world rather suddenly. If I remember rightly, the brother was living in a house of some pretensions, standing in its own grounds." "Yes, that is so. I see you recollect all about the case." "My dear fellow," said Jervis, "Thorndyke never forgets a likely case. He's a sort of medico-legal camel. He gulps down the raw facts from the newspapers or elsewhere, and then, in his leisure moments, he calmly regurgitates them and has a quiet chew at them. It is a quaint habit. A case crops up in the papers or in one of the courts, and Thorndyke swallows it whole. Then it lapses and everyone forgets it. A year or two later it crops up in a new form, and, to your astonishment, you find that Thorndyke has got it all cut and dried. He has been ruminating on it periodically in the interval." "You notice," said Thorndyke, "that my learned friend is pleased to indulge in mixed metaphors. But his statement is substantially true, though obscurely worded. You must tell us more about the Bellinghams when we have fortified you with a cup of tea." Our talk had brought us to Thorndyke's chambers, which were on the first floor of No. 5A, King's Bench Walk. and as we entered the fine, spacious, paneled room we found a small elderly man, neatly dressed in black, setting out the tea service on the table. I glanced at him with some curiosity. He hardly looked like a servant, in spite of his neat black clothes. In fact, his appearance was rather puzzling, for while his quiet dignity and his serious, intelligent face suggested some kind of professional man, his neat, capable hands were those of a skilled mechanic. Thorndyke surveyed the tea tray thoughtfully, and then looked at his retainer. "I see you have put 3 teacups, Polton," he said. "Now, how did you know I was bringing someone in to tea?" The little man smiled a quaint, crinkly smile of gratification as he explained. "I happened to look out of the laboratory window as you turned the corner, sir." "How disappointingly simple," said Jervis. "We were hoping for something abstruse and telepathic." "Simplicity is the soul of efficiency, sir," replied Polton, as he checked the tea service to make sure that nothing was forgotten, and with this remarkable aphorism he silently evaporated. "To return to the Bellingham case," said Thorndyke, when he had poured out the tea. "Have you picked up any facts relating to the parties? And facts, I mean, of course, that it would be proper for you to mention? I have learned 1 or 2 things that there is no harm in repeating. For instance, I gather that Godfrey Bellingham, my patient, lost all his property quite suddenly about the time of the disappearance." "That is really odd," said Thorndyke. "The opposite condition would be quite understandable, but one doesn't see exactly how this can have happened, unless there was an allowance of some sort." "No, that was what struck me. But there seem to be some queer features in the case, and the legal position is evidently getting complicated. There is a will, for example, which is giving trouble." "They will hardly be able to administer the will without either proof or presumption of death," Thorndyke remarked. "Exactly. That's one of the difficulties. Another is that there seems to be some fatal defect in the drafting of the will itself. I don't know what it is, but I expect I shall hear sooner or later. By the way, I mentioned the interest that you have taken in the case, and I think Bellingham would have liked to consult you, but, of course, the poor devil has no money." "That is awkward for him if the other interested parties have. There will probably be legal proceedings of some kind, and as the law takes no account of poverty, he is likely to go to the wall. He ought to have advice of some sort." "I don't see how he is going to get it," said I. "Neither do I," Thorndyke admitted. "There are no hospitals for impecunious litigants. It is assumed that only persons of means have a right to go to law. Of course, if we knew the man and the circumstances, we might be able to help him. But for all we know to the contrary, he may be an arrant scoundrel." I had recalled the strange conversation that I had overheard, and wondered what Thorndyke would have thought of it if it had been allowable for me to repeat it. Obviously it was not, however, and I could only give my own impressions. "He doesn't strike me as that," I said, "but of course one never knows. Personally, he impressed me rather favorably, which is more than the other man did." "What other man?" asked Thorndyke. "There was another man in the case, wasn't there? I forget his name. I saw him at the house and didn't much like the look of him. I suspect he's putting some sort of pressure on Bellingham." "Berkeley knows more about this than he's willing to tell us," said Jervis. "Let us look up the report and see who this stranger is." He took down from a shelf a large volume of newspaper cuttings and laid it on the table. "You see," said he, as he ran his finger down the index, "Thorndyke files all the cases that are likely to come to something, and I know he had expectations regarding this one. I fancy he had some ghoulish hope that the missing gentleman's head might turn up in somebody's dustbin. Here we are. The other man's name is Hurst. He is apparently a cousin, and it was at his house the missing man was last seen alive." "So you think Mr. Hurst is moving in the matter?" said Thorndyke, when he had glanced over the report. "That is my impression," I replied, "though I really know nothing about it." "Well," said Thorndyke, "if you should learn what is being done and should have permission to speak of it, I shall be very interested to hear how the case progresses, and if an unofficial opinion on any point would be of service, I think there would be no harm in giving it." "It would certainly be of great value if the other parties are taking professional advice," I said; and then, after a pause, I asked, "Have you given this case much consideration?" Thorndyke reflected. "No," he said, "I can't say that I have. I turned it over rather carefully when the report first appeared, and I have speculated on it occasionally since. It is my habit, as Jervis was telling you, to utilize odd moments of leisure, such as a railway journey, for instance, by constructing theories to account for the facts of such obscure cases as have come